Hello and salam. Welcome to Muslim Viewpoint, a new podcast series powered by American Muslim Today. We're a groundbreaking non-profit digital newspaper who champions civic engagement. AMT informs and empowers the diverse voices of almost 30 million Muslims here in the US and other Western countries. I'm Rifat Malik. I'm AMT's editor-in-chief, and today we have an interview with Dr. Nour Akhras, who recently published a book about her first-hand experience as a pediatrician caring for the Syrian refugees impacted by civil war and Western sanctions. As a pediatric infectious disease expert, one of only 1,500 in the United States, Akhras saw firsthand their human suffering as a relief worker with aid agency Med Global. She spoke to our reporter, Maya Gaylor.
And then I could send you that link.
Okay, awesome. Perfect. That's great. Thank you. Yes, because we are going to be doing, so we're going to be using this audio for our podcast and radio show, and then we'll also do an online article. So the media package will be great to use for pictures, so thank you for that. All right, and then we can go ahead and get started if you're ready.
Yep.
Okay, so if you can just start by telling me what exactly led you on your mission of, serving these war-torn areas?
So the first one was kind of an impromptu invitation when I was at a gathering when the war in Syria had first started and the first set of refugees had just arrived in Turkey in the summer into the fall of 2011. And so nobody expected that the war would last this long. It's been going on for 12 years now. So I had been at a dinner, and the leader of the medical mission had invited me, and he said, we don't have a pediatrician. We need a pediatrician. Would you like to come? Will you accompany us on this trip? And so in my mind, I had always thought that I would do something like that, but not when I had such young children. And at the time I had two small kids. But in any case, so I did go, and that mission really changed my life, and it changed the trajectory of my life. Just, seeing people in such horrendous conditions and always imagining myself in their place. Like, what if I was stuck in a refugee camp with small children? Wouldn't I want somebody to help me? And so that kind of was the mindset then.
Right. So, kind of what was that like for you, juggling all of that, seeing that, and then, like you said, having small children at home?
Yeah, it was really difficult. I mean, listening to people's stories, hearing how their homes had been bombed, how barrel bombs worked, how people had lost their loved ones in really horrific ways, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods. That was really hard. It was hard to leave my children, obviously, but I knew that they were in the care of their grandparents, and so I trusted people, and so that was kind of in the back of my mind that they were with people who loved them and were taking care of them. So that wasn't as difficult, but hearing these stories and listening to people talk about what they were experiencing in Syria and what led them to leave, and then seeing their new conditions. Their families are five or six living in small tents with no end in sight. And, just knowing now, 12 years later, a lot of these people are still there, still in these living conditions. And then coming back to the United States, and then you come back to your, seemingly normal life. And that's just difficult too, because lots of people have existential crises after they have these experiences, because you think what am I doing here? What does my life mean? And, and then normal everyday conversations seems so frivolous, I don't know, does my pants match my shirt, or what color should we paint this room, or does this carpet match our our home decor, things like that just seem so frivolous, and it's hard to wrap your head around. Just last week I was talking to somebody who just lost their husband and had a baby in a refugee camp, and now I'm talking about whether I want to paint this wall green. It doesn't add up. It's kind of traumatic. But thankfully that experience, the experience of the existential crisis, it fades, and you kind of, acclimate back to your normal life. But the stories stick with you. And, even when I write about them now, or I talk about them, I still get kind of emotional, even though it's been many years since I've come back.
Yeah, exactly. And because you've experienced all of this and there is that juxtaposition I didn't even think about. So why is it so important that you wrote these stories down and share this experience?
I think a lot of people don't know what refugees experience, especially in light of the last 5 to 10 years, where there's been a real rise in anti-refugee or anti-migrant sentiments. And, people are like, oh, why are these people here? They're coming here to take over our jobs or take over our space or invade our space. And it's like, well, if you talk to a refugee, then you would know why they left their homes, the comfort of their homes. Like nobody leaves the comfort of their homes for a refugee camp unless what they're experiencing is so horrific. And so for me, even publishing the book, the whole reason was to shed light on these human stories and to humanize refugees and their experiences, as opposed to like just painting them with one brush that they're just a burden on society. No, they're not. They're not a burden on society. We should see them as their potential, what potential they can be or contribute to our society. But they can't live up to their potential if we don't provide them with safety, security, education, jobs. Like they need all of those things so they can rise to their fullest potential.
Yeah, and so can you tell me about, what the writing process for this book was like? What kind of challenges did you face? Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I started writing back in 2019, and actually the impetus for writing was I had an experience where I just saw how powerful storytelling is. In 2018, after I had my last child, I traveled to California to visit a friend, and she introduced me to a young Yemeni American man named Mukhtar Al-Khanchali, and he's a coffee entrepreneur. And we were talking, and he was like, "Oh, I was just in Yemen, and then the war broke out, and I had to hightail it out of Yemen." And I was like, "Oh, I was just in Yemen. I had to hightail it out of Yemen too." And so we kind of bonded over that experience. And then a year later, the famous American author Dave Eggers had written a book about him, about Mukhtar, about coffee, the history of coffee, and how it came from Yemen. And they were doing a book tour. And as part of their tour, they came through Chicago. And so I told my husband, like, let's go. I met this guy. Let's go listen to this, this book event. And it was at a downtown building, and it was like kind of like a poshy place. And there was all these older American people coming to listen to this author, and they had like they had a slideshow, and so they were showing pictures of Yemen and Yemeni people, and they talked about the Yemeni war. And I was like, wow, if these people didn't come to this book event, half of them, if not all of them, probably would have never been able to identify Yemen on a map. But here they are talking about Yemen, talking about the Yemeni experience. And so I thought, okay, well, Syria's been going on for a decade now. Maybe if I write about it, it'll go back on people's radars, or people think about it, and we can just humanize the experience. And the ultimate goal is to find a political resolution so these people can go back home. There's 6 million refugees scattered throughout the world, and another 5 to 6 million who are internally displaced in Syria. And I'm sure all of these people, they just want to go back home.
Yeah, exactly. So what is, maybe one story or one fact, one experience that you had in your time there that you would really want to share and let people know that's part of your book,
Yeah, I think one of the take-home points for me is that like Syrians didn't expect this to happen. In the beginning of the book, I talk about how my uncle, who has lived his whole life in Syria, most of his life, I mean, he's been in the United States for residency training, but he's an obstetrician gynecologist, and he was over 70 when the war started in Syria. And right before the war, he was here in Chicago. And I said, hey, do you think that the Arab Spring is coming to Syria? And he's like, no way. And the president of Syria himself said the same thing. So Syrians didn't expect this to happen. And I think if you talk to Ukrainians right before the war in Ukraine, they'll say the same thing. If you talk to people from Sudan right before this violence broke out in Sudan recently, they'll say the same thing. So I think one of the take-home points for me is anyone can become a refugee. And we think that we just live in this so much safety and security, and that all that fighting is over there and it'll never happen to us. But, if we even think about January 6th, like how close did our country come to a civil war? We were pretty close, I think. And so to think that that will never happen to me, I think is a delusion, because all of those people thought that that would never happen to them. And so these people, these refugees, are just everyday human beings, just like me and you, So a lot of them I talked to on my first trip were like, they were moms, you know, they were taking care of their kids in Syria before the war broke out. They were doing everyday mom things, taking care of their children, cooking, cleaning, you know, laundry, whatever, some of the work, some of them didn't. Um, and then all of a sudden they were hurled into this violence, and then into this experience becoming a refugee. So I think the take home point for me is like, I could have been them, they could have been me, and it's the same thing for anybody who reads this book. Like, don't think that this experience will never happen to you or could never happen to you, because it can. And I think we should really think about like what we would want somebody to do for us if God forbid that ever happened to us.
Yeah. So what do you hope to really accomplish by publishing your experience? And then is there any kind of call to action that you have for anyone who's could be in your audience?
I hope to humanize the refugee story, and I hope people can see them as human beings and as hardworking individuals, and that they did something that anybody else in their position would do. Like if we were sitting in our home and all of a sudden barrel bombs started raining down on our homes, we would pick up and move, and we would, you know, put our kids in a rubber dinghy and cross the sea for safety and security. So that's like the number one message, and then the calls to action, there are a few, some of them being like, you know, if you live in a city that has a refugee agency, you can volunteer with a refugee agency, you can adopt a refugee family, help them acclimate to your city. You know, little things like teaching them how to use the transit system or their driver's license, the library. Like there's so many little things that you can teach someone who just moved to your city who doesn't speak the language. And then you could also donate to refugee agencies, donate to organizations that are working on the ground in Syria or Turkey. Actually, a portion of the proceeds from this book, from any purchase of the book, is going to go to Med Global, which is an international NGO that's working in that area and other areas, in disaster areas like Colombia, Venezuela, Bangladesh, and Yemen. And then the third call to action would be to write our politicians and our representatives to keep borders open, to make a humane path to citizenship, to, you know, especially in terms of Syria, to kind of work on a political resolution so that people can go back home.
And just for a little more insight into the situation in Syria, 22 million of Syrians have been forced to flee their home due to the ongoing civil war that began in 2011, when protests against the Syrian government led to a violent crackdown by the regime, triggering a full-scale armed conflict. As the conflict intensified, widespread violence ensued, along with human rights abuses and the destruction of infrastructure. The war has killed hundreds of thousands of people in the 10 years since it began. It's estimated that 6.7 million people are internally displaced inside Syria. More than half of them are women and children. The neighboring countries most affected by the influx of Syrian refugees include Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iran, and Egypt. These countries have carried a significant burden in providing shelter, food, and health care to millions of displaced families. The sheer scale of this disaster has strained their resources and infrastructure, creating challenges in meeting the basic needs of refugees. Recently, Lebanon has begun conducting raids to deport Syrians, as politicians have blamed refugees for their country's downfalls. Europe has also seen a significant influx of Syrian refugees, with many embarking on dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean Sea to seek asylum. This has posed complex challenges for European countries in terms of managing the arrival, integration, and processing of asylum claims. Nearly 1 million people have applied for international protection in the European Union last year in 2022. Syrians continue to be the top nationality of asylum seekers in Europe, with more than 130,000 applications. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and various non-governmental organizations have been actively involved in providing assistance and support to refugees. They have worked to address immediate needs such as shelter, food, healthcare, and education, as well as advocating for long-term solutions and resettlement options. However, finding a comprehensive and lasting solution to the crisis remains a significant challenge, given the complex dynamics involved and the involvement of multiple actors within and outside Syria.
Well, thank you for that, Maya. And thank you for joining both of us this week. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at American Muslim Today. And if you'd like to read more about this story and access more digital content, feel free to check out our website, AmericanMuslimToday.com. We'll see you next week on The Muslim Viewpoint. Bye for now.